Thank you. Good morning. As Chris mentioned, my background is as a professional practicing artist, which I've done for something like 40 years, and an academic psychologist teaching psychology at Coventry University. What I've tried to do in my art practice is to bring both areas together. I've got one foot in the field of academic psychology, one foot in the field of professional art practice. And what I'm going to do this morning is an autobiographical talk. It's about my work. Artists like talking about their work. So I'm going to try and compress something like 40 years of art practice into 30 minutes with a reference to what might be called art and mental illness or psychopathology, but there will be a reference to that which will have a bearing on this conference. But primarily, most of my talks in the past have been to artists, psychologists, even computer scientists, but never to neuropsychiatrists. So I hope you bear with the autobiographical description of my art practice, but there will be connections with the field of your practice. The basic theme of my talk is order and disorder. Order and disorder in art practice and in the history of art, and particularly 20th century art and my own art, and order and disorder in visual perception, in normal visual perception processes, and to some extent in abnormal visual processes. And the relationship between those abnormal visual processes and the aesthetics of pictorial art. To begin at the beginning, these are two drawings I did in my early teens. So before I went to art school, maybe I was 14 or 15, they're members of my family. When I just sat on the left-hand side there is my grandma, sat and drew my grandma, another member of my family. I put these in as an example of the way I drew before art school, the way I sort of naturally drew as an early teenager. It was my, as it were, what I thought was just a normal way of drawing. Looking back at them, they're fairly accurate, they're fairly objective, quite realistic. But I think it just came too easily. What I was particularly interested in wasn't so much that it's my grandma. It's not my grandma. It's a drawing. It's charcoal on paper. What I was interested in is the details at the bottom. What's going on here? This is the actual drawing, not my grandma. So many art students will be quite happy to continue honing their skills on visual representation, which I did as an art student. This is one of my undergraduate paintings, which I suppose demonstrates a certain amount of technical skill in objective representation, use of space, description, a man sitting on a chair in front of a green wall. How it's possible to continue this process, to just get better and better at technical skill. But you end up just doing what virtually every other portraitist or objective realist artist does. What I wanted to do was something different. I wanted to follow the actual bones of the painting. So the hand there, it isn't a hand. It's a piece of abstract painting. And that's what I was particularly interested in. And did a series of paintings like this. How do you make paintings which are formally and aesthetically chaotic, not representation? I could do the representation. I could do the objective naturalistic thing. At the end of my degree course, I was offered a scholarship at the Royal Academy to continue that technical accomplishment of representation. Instead, I didn't go to the Royal Academy. I continued painting like this for a while, trying to do chaotic paintings, disruptive paintings, sometimes described as a transgressive or anarchistic attitude towards art practice. Now, there is a tradition of this in 20th century art. Some of you are familiar with 20th century, the history of 20th century art, will be familiar with the Surrealists. On the left here is a drawing by André Masson, French Surrealist. Automatic drawing. It's a kind of free association. On the right is Max Ernst, frottage. It's using textures to create visual images. What they're looking for is accident, chance, a disruption of all the normal traditions of composition, of representation. Basically, as far as the history of art's concerned, started with the Impressionist reaction against the traditional French Academy and setting up their own independent exhibitions, and continued through post-Impressionism, Cubism, Dadaism, and a number of other isms, where artists were trying to create disorder in order to bring something new, a new aesthetic, out of the chaos or the disorder. It's breaking the rules. This is André Michaud, the French artist working in the 1950s. To some extent, he cheated. He's taking mescaline. But he's taking mescaline in order to do what I'm describing, break the rules. What I've subsequently tried to do, or what I was trying to do, was, as it were, break the aesthetic rules, break the aesthetic conventions, but without any LSD or mescaline or those interventions that many artists took to create the, as it disordered or poetic imagery. Have I?
You went on to slides 1 week.
Sorry, I'm going. You suddenly jumped to the end. Hang on.
Went straight to side Twombly.
Yeah, okay. We
click on this. No.
Yeah, I've suddenly clicked right to the end. Yeah, okay. I can continue doing this, can't I? Yeah. The paintings by Joan Mitchell, the American abstract expressionist. If any of you saw the big abstract expressionist show at the Royal Academy a couple of years ago, these were major exhibits. So they're not, as it were, the works of obscure artists. These are the works of what are regarded as major Western artists, part of the Western canon. Jackson Pollock enabled painting to find its own way to the canvas. Again, forms of disruption. Cy Twombly, using just scribbles, and in some cases, my own work, I tried drawing with my eyes closed. I tried drawing with my left hand instead of my right hand. Sometimes worked on the canvas, turned it upside down. And all techniques, and some in music, people like Stockhausen, John Cage used accidental effects to gain. Even David Bowie, for example, took sentences, chopped them up, rearranged the words to come up with something new, something different, something abnormal in traditional aesthetic terms, but used to discover new modes of representation, a new aesthetic. Instead of going to the Royal Academy to continue honing these representational skills, what I found was that something was preventing me from executing the disorder I wanted to create. Something was getting in the way of producing accidental and chance effects, of being disruptive. I didn't know what it was. It was as if there was something controlling the accident. I wanted to produce something chaotic. Something was stopping me, something was getting in the way. So instead of going to the Royal Academy, I went to Reading University to study psychology and to try to find out what was going on in here that was interfering with my art practice and that transgressive art process and the creation of disorder over against order. Order wasn't a problem. I knew all the techniques and methods for representation and composition. It was a disorder that was the problem, generating the disorder. What was preventing me from doing that? What was imposing order against my will and against my choices? So I specialised in visual perception, perception of pictorial form. But where to start? Well, I started with the drawings of infants, infant scribbling, where the infants hadn't acquired any compositional skills. They hadn't acquired representational skills. So if you follow the development of child art from, say, the age of 2 to 3, where the marks are simply the product of mechanical arm movement with very little authorial control, and then see what happens as the control develops. It's this closely related to memory. The child discovers that it can make circular scribbles, and it can repeat circular scribbles, and it can remember circular scribbles. And the circular scribble becomes, as it were, the first piece of control imagery. But the circle is a geometrical shape. It's not a piece of representation. It's not somebody's tie or foot or hand. Then the child can make more circles and squares and vertical lines and horizontal lines. So what's happening in the child's discovery of a pictorial language is basically geometrical. It's a use of geometrical signs and symbols to build a vocabulary that stands for things in the world. So mummy might just be a circle with 2 circles for eyes. It's a different mode of representation. And these might go through from, children of course develop at different rates, but between 2 to 3, up to 4 to 5 years old. Most of the, I think some of the best work on this has been done by Rhoda Kellogg in her book, Analysing Children's Drawings. But what it told me was that Gestalt principles in perception were one of the theories, this is in my MPhil that I did at Reading, one of the theories interfering with my ability to make chaotic images was Gestalt principles, figure ground, and basic geometrical principles that exist or are described by the Gestalt psychologists. So this became one of the 2 theories that I developed in my MPhil work, where there is a tendency to order. It's there in the child's development, this tendency to order and geometrical forms. And the other is sensory tonic theory. So these are the 2 theories that I arrived at, where there are, as it were, inbuilt mechanisms or processes which, as it were, control or determine the way we perceive objects and the way we perceive the world. Without figure ground perception, we can't distinguish thing from background. What I was interested in was the way in which those theories and those ideas were instrumental in interfering with the ability to produce aesthetic disorder and chaotic images. So I knew then what was preventing me from producing the kind of imagery I wanted to produce. The 2 theories, sensory tonic, Gestalt theory. Being curious about the machinery which underlie the theories. The theories themselves, they're real, they're genuine, they do occur. There's nobody here that doesn't have figure ground perception. If you didn't have it, you wouldn't be able to find your way here or actually function in the world. So the theories are there, and with sensory tonic theory, to understand the nuts and bolts, I wrote to the Dean of the Queen Elizabeth Medical School in Birmingham, and described what I was doing, and I said, is it possible, with these 2 theories of visual perception, is it possible to find out or examine what the neural mechanisms are underlying them? I think my curiosity was taking me too far, really. And he said, well, there's nobody else doing work like this, so yeah, come to the medical school, I'll work with you, and we'll try to work out if it's possible to identify the actual brain mechanisms underlying the two theories of form perception. So I spent a year at the QE, working with the dean of the school there, and found that the brain mechanisms underlying Gestalt theory simply can't be identified. I talked to one psychologist, and he said, well, I can identify some nerve cells in the brain when the eye reaches a corner. You go along a line, hit the corner, some nerves fire, I can say where they are, but a circle. Circles are far too complicated. I have no idea how the brain is actually processing the visual perception of a circle. As far as Gestalt theory is concerned, I was then stumped. I couldn't take it any further. With sensory tonic theory, these are attempts, these are notes, just visual diagrams and notes from my research at the medical school, trying to work out what the relationships might be between the body and the brain and the way we actually see pictures and the way we see the world. And of course there is, and I found, nerve pathways that connect the inner ear for balancing, the body muscles and the eye muscles. They're all connectable. But that still doesn't explain what's going on in the central nervous system, what's happening in the cortex, what's affecting consciousness. But as far as the art history is concerned, the theory is interesting in that it does relate to three major theories of art. Classical art employs the verticals and horizontals. It's an art aesthetic of repose, balance, calmness, harmony that relates to the body, and gravity, and the way and our bilateral symmetry. The other major theory, Baroque, Rococo, employs rhythmic forms, swirling forms. They trace those back to the work of Rubens and the Baroque period that immediately followed the Renaissance, the Rococo, which followed on from the Baroque, but it's a technique which Van Gogh employed. There's a series of drawings when he was hospitalized at Saint-Remy. They did the cypress trees, but his technique gradually became increasingly rhythmic. And the third is Expressionism. Expressionism employs dynamic forms, diagonals, spiky, pointed forms. Again, potentially collapsible down into the body and the body's orientation, the body's balance. This, of course, you most recognize Picasso's painting of Guernica, and an attempt to, symbolically use the horse, the disemboweled horse and the bull, but also to employ aesthetic devices which are not restful, they're not classical. They are aggressive, they're sharp, they're associated, collapsible down into a particular kind of theory of visual perception. At this stage, I thought I really need to get back to applying to art practice something of what I've learned from psychology. I'm not going to continue down the road of trying to become a professional psychologist in the sense of continuing to research the nervous system and taking it down that road. Immediately I got a lectureship in psychology of art at Coventry, lecturing psychology and visual perception to arts and design students and to art historians, and needed to return to my history of practice as a practicing artist. And this took three forms. And it was trying to get the research back into art practice. One is using artworks as an ideas processing method. So the research I was doing was on sheets of processing. And sometimes it took 2-3 years. A sheet might end up like a thesis or like an essay, but they were done in a certain kind of aesthetic, so they were exhibitable. So these works that I was producing were research, they're my own research, but as it were, the research converted into exhibitable artworks. These have all been exhibited in galleries, but they're, as it were, mental maps, and maps associated with research. So instead of the research going into research presentations, continued presentations on psychology, it went into these, as it were, diagrams. In my exhibition at Coventry University last year, with the catalogue is at the back, they're all free, please take one, I don't want to take them back to Coventry with me. There were 75 of these works tracing the history of my research embedded in visual exhibitable images like these. And I brought an example of this one at the back there. So you can see 3 examples of the work with the chart. They're like research papers, but they're research papers as exhibitable artworks. The second aspect of my work, trying to relate the psychology to the art, relates back to Gestalt theory, the random dots. At what point does a set of random dots become something recognizable? It's like seeing faces in the fire, that kind of thing. So a lot of the work I did, and the work I'm still doing, is on taking random dot arrangements like the one on the left and gradually arranging them in such a way that the brain begins to interpret something, recognize something. On the right, it's gradually moving towards landscape. But at a certain point, it's neither landscape nor random arrangement. But what's going into this, what's going into thinking behind this, is that relationship between the Gestalt principles of visual organization and the creation of an exhibitable or completed artwork. This is my studio right now, up in Coventry. These are random dot arrangements which gradually turn into portraits. But again, it's looking at that interface between the randomness and the order, between disorder and representation, as that interface, and that's really the theme of my talk, order and disorder. And these works are, on the left, that's the handwriting, as it were. They're the marks. That's the substructure. And if you remember the picture drawing I did earlier of my granny, and the man in the front of the green wall, I showed the substructure. That's 40 years ago. I'm still doing that. But I'm doing it with an added theoretical knowledge of how visual perception works. So at some point, these things coalesce. I talked to one artist friend, and he said, well, the way I see it is you've got a head, and it's fragmenting. But it's not that way around. It's not a representation of a head that's then breaking up. It's broken up, fragmented forms, taken to the point where a head, a person, begins to emerge from it. The important thing is this is all under control. It's not the product of some pathological process or mental illness or mental abnormality or brain abnormality. I'm having to do this because there's nothing wrong with my brain as far as I know. I'm having to do this, as it were, technically. Part of my procedure as an artist. I can easily switch to doing a very objective portrait like the portraits out here. But I'm choosing to destroy that, to break that up and look at that relationship between order and disorder in perception, the way I see, and aesthetics. Again, you can see on the right that this could gradually develop into a highly realistic portrait. But the basic vocabulary, syntax as it were, is fragmentation, disorder, broken up images. The third technique is part of the tradition of automatic drawing. automatic writing. The Surrealists developed. And the Surrealists developed that technique having read Freudian theory. They were pretty obsessed with Freud and Freud's ideas about free associating. Just let anything come out. Just speak, just talk. But you have somebody there who listens and tries to make sense of it. Is there something coming up from the unconscious accidentally, by chance, that tells you more about that person's psyche, that person's thought process, than they can actually tell you if they're not free associating. I believe in the literature it's called secondary elaboration. What I'm trying here is automatic drawing followed by secondary elaboration, but it's my own secondary elaboration. I'm playing two roles. I'm playing one of the free association, the automatic drawing on the left, which could be regarded as doodling, but it's not the kind of doodling that you might do on your notes of just little geometrical patterns. It's a particular kind of doodling. It's a particular kind of visual free association and handwriting. Then, when the page or the canvas is full, I step aside, put my psychology hat on, and think, now how can I make sense of this? What does this mean? What can I draw out of this? Is there meaning in it? And then organize it into a narrative. The painting, I've done it again. I keep touching something here. The painting on the right, it's about 6 foot by 5 foot. It's part of a series of 25 paintings that were done in this way that I exhibited about 4 years ago in a gallery in Leamington Spa. Finished, what I consider finished paintings. But they become a finished elaboration, a worked up elaboration of what I regard as, on the left, a fairly chaotic free association. But the whole principle of my practice has been, what do you pull out of the chaos? What do you pull out of the disorder? You create the disorder and then pull something out of it that has aesthetic meaning. I remember one morning, my father, when I was living at home, my father tried to talk, and he couldn't. He could say words. He could say, I, going, pictures, cinema. He couldn't say, I'm going to the cinema. Somehow, the kind of semantic meaning he couldn't put together. He could say the word. He was told he'd had a stroke. Now, where the damage was, where the injury was, I don't know. I don't even know if the doctors knew. Except it was so specific. It didn't affect his ability to say words. There was no physical effect at all. He just couldn't create meaning from the words that he could say. And this relationship between marks and meaning is really what my talk is about, and what my career has been about, and what my work, 5 minutes, what my work has been about. And these are examples of the products of that free association, that conversion of the disorder and chaos into something that makes sense. Or maybe you do think it doesn't make sense. Maybe you think, looking at these, you might think these paintings on the right have some degree of abnormality about them. Maybe you might think, well, it must be a bit odd anyway to produce paintings like that. Why would he produce paintings like that when he can paint like he could paint 40 years ago, this representational painting? Well, I suppose it's in search of poetry. It's in search of something that doesn't have conventional meaning, conventional purpose. Breaking the rules in order to discover something fresh and something new. In my own case, the effort I've made has been to try to find out what's actually going on in here, what's going on in perception while this is happening. And that's all been the subject of my lecture courses with the art students. Finally, have I got a couple of minutes now?
You can have a couple of mine.
Oh, thank you. Can I have 5 minutes of your time? Thanks, Andrew. Andrew and I, we were students together in Bristol. We've worked in not collaboration, but we've known each other for 50 years. I'm a great admirer of his work. He's a much better artist than I am, believe me. He's the real McCoy. I'm the academic, but I do make pictures. A friend of mine, he was at the Royal College at the same time as Andrew. He's a competent painter, a trained painter. Recently, he had a stroke. It hasn't affected his manual skills, manual ability. He can paint portraits. And he's tried to paint a self-portrait. He tried to do 2 self-portraits here, which he sent me. And these are his self-portraits. But they're the product of him having a stroke. He's trying to do representational painting. He's quite capable of doing representation under normal circumstances. But the way I've used techniques to break down normal perceptual and aesthetic processes, in his work, they're being broken down for him by something interfering with his aesthetic perception. I don't know what it is. I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't know if anybody knows. If anyone can say, it's that group of cells there. That's the group of cells that enables you to make an objective portrait of yourself. And they've been damaged, and now you can't do it. The next one is closer to home. This artist, William Uttermorland, is a portraitist working in London, and if you read the bottom, in 1995, the age of 61, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. In the literature, he's sometimes called Alzheimer's, sometimes called dementia, but the important thing about him as a case study is he continued drawing as his condition developed, as his deterioration developed. 2 minutes, good timing. And this is a product. Now, I've shown these to artists, and artists that we much prefer these to the previous ones. But they are artists who are trained in the tradition of disruption and abstraction. But as his illness developed, his drawings became increasingly fragmented, increasingly disordered. I don't know what the dementia or Alzheimer's did in his brain to cause him to fail to make the representational portraits that he was able to make. But there's you know more about Alzheimer's than I do. You're more about dementia and what happens in the brain. I just know what the evidence is in my own practice and in case studies like this, where there's a breakdown of some kind of perceptual or aesthetic process that doesn't necessarily interfere with the physical making, the handling of brush, the handling of the medium, but interferes with the perception of the object that's being represented and makes it impossible even for a skilled portraitist to produce that. That's his skill as an artist. Now, if it were me, I'd be trying to use techniques and methods, because I've got nothing wrong with my brain, techniques and methods to break this down, maybe to arrive at something like that. In his case, it was being broken down for him. Thank you.